Thank you very much, Sophie. And it's lovely that so many people have come along. I still find it absolutely extraordinary that there are people out there listening from, I think I saw the Outer Hebrides earlier, and a little earlier, Ontario, Worcester, USA, and of course, lots of local people. And I think some of you who worked at the porcelain, and I'd love to hear more from you later as well. Whilst I've got my slide on sharing mode, I can't actually see you, so I'm sort of talking into a blank screen. So forgive me if that's a little bit weird, but I know you're there and I know you're listening. So to give you a bit more background, as Sophie says, in 2007, I was employed by the Museum of Royal Worcester through a National Lottery Heritage Grant to record around about 45 people who had worked at the Royal Worcester factory from the late 1930s up to the then present day. That was just before the factory closed in 2008. And what a fascinating year it was. So by the end of my collecting period, I'd got about 50 hours of audio recordings, a handful of written memories and dozens of photos. And this became an oral history archive, which we've called The Worker's Story. And I'm hoping to give you a flavour of what's in this collection, and also a bit later on to hear some stories about Christmas in the factory. First, if you don't know much about oral history and how it's collected, I wanted to explain a little. Typically, an oral history interview is a long, in-depth recording. And when I say long, some of these interviews are averagely 1.5 hours in length, some are a bit longer. And what people reveal over this length of time is extraordinary. I mean, they talk a lot about themselves, a lot about their lives, their job, and of course, their opinions about things. And they talk about what was important to them and in their own words, and they give detailed descriptions of what they did and how they did it, which of course is absolutely wonderful stuff for an archive. But of course, oral history does come with a bit of a caveat. People don't always remember things accurately. And you may hear things today that you disagree with, or perhaps you have your own version of. So if that's the case, we'd love to hear from you. So for all sorts of reasons, as Sophie suggested earlier, the Worker's Story Archive has sat largely undisturbed for the past 17 years, mainly due to lots of things such as funding and time. It takes a long time to go through 50 hours of recording. And the fact that the audio recordings were hard to access, technology has also moved on a lot in the last 17 years. But we have now got some funding to update the collection and we hope make it more accessible. And over the last few weeks, I've had the chance to go back through the interviews, some of which I haven't listened to for 17 years. And listening again, I really marvel at the little things people remember, the small details. And I marvel at just how much really unique information is stored in these audio files. We're now starting to think of ways of sharing the recordings more widely. And this talk is one of the first attempts to do that sharing. So you are literally the guinea pigs. So I want to give you a flavour of the breadth of the material in the collection, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. So over the next 30 minutes or so, you'll hear from a range of people talking about where they worked and what they did. So let's get properly started. On this slide, on the left-hand side, you'll see Joyce Holloway, and on the right, Stella Chambers. Now, these two started working in the factory a very long time ago. Joyce in the enamelling department, straight from school in 1937, and Stella in the burnishing department about 15 years later. So when I start an oral history interview, I first ask people about their background and where they grew up. And then we get on to their first connection with work and with the factory. And an early question that I like to ask is if they can remember their first day. As for lots of people, it's etched really clearly on their memory. So I'm going to play you first the answers I got from Joyce and Stella. And while you're listening, just remember how young they were. They were 14 and 15. And then think about what 14 and 15-year-olds are doing these days.
In front of me was looked like a stack of plates and saucers with a cup on top. These contained the turps and the fat oil, as it was called, to mix your colours with. I was given several brushes and a palette knife. And for hours and for days, and what seemed like years, but actually wasn't. I was doing fine lines and then forget-me-not petals and then shading with a brush to do rose petals.
The first job I ever did was a box of Warm Street coffee cans, a whole box full, and it took me all day. I had to wet sand, that's like a piece of rag on your finger, dipping it into water, then into sand and going round. Then you had to dry sand it all with a chamois leather and soap sand. That was my first job, and I've never known such a long day. I was absolutely shattered, I was, and I was that bored of doing these cans all day, but they had to be just right.
But despite being bored and exhausted, and I think had rubbed her knuckles considerably inside the coffee cans, Stella carried on working at the factory for nearly 40 years. And Joyce also worked there for a very long time. She worked there for nearly 20 years and married a chap that she met at work, Jack, who was foreman of the aerographers department. And in fact, lots of the people that I interviewed met, went out with, and sometimes married people that they met at work. And that's hardly surprising. It was a very vibrant place, good social scene, and it extended from the canteen to the various sports clubs, skittles and darts teams, the drama group, dances and parties that went on, whist drives, day trips, even trips abroad, and of course evenings in the various local pubs around the factory. Lots of people talk about the atmosphere at the factory, the family atmosphere, and sometimes literally because several members of a family would work alongside each other, but also the feeling that the factory was one big family. Let's have a look at what it looks like today. It has changed so much over the years, and particularly since it closed in 2008. And if you wander around the area today, as I did at the weekend, it's very smart and very tidy and very peaceful. And it's really hard to imagine what it was like, what it looked like, what it smelt like, what it sounded like when it was a place of work. So let's hear a couple of impressions of that. We're going to hear in a minute from Peter Ewens, top right, who came to Worcester in 1959 to set up a design department, and Mick Braddock below him, who started as an electrician around about the same time. These two men clocked up 80 years at Royal Worcester between them.
I arrived, in fact, as one of the 4 porcelain kilns was being fired up, and those were coal-fired. The local women got to know when this was going to happen and didn't put the washing out that day. That end of the town would be literally shrouded in smoke when these kilns were lit up. Heaven knows what it was like when there were 14 of them on the factory.
Parts of the factory was very dirty. We used to get covered in soot and the clay dust. A lot of the yard was absolute pigsty, really. There was rubbish dumped everywhere, and it was a sort of no man's land. And it was only of latter years when I latched onto the fact that it was really my responsibility, and we no doubt kept it cleaner, but it was a problem, stuff being dumped on the yard, old machines and product.
And Mick goes on to talk about a dozen skips a week that took rubbish from the factory site to landfill at Holt Fleet, and that these skips were full of clay, plaster, moulds, broken product, old machinery, you name it. And I just find it amazing that so many beautiful and fragile objects were made in a place that was so full of dirt and dust and rubbish, and not just rubbish. So I'm going to introduce you to Harry Merrick. Harry came to Worcester in 1936 under a government work scheme during the Depression. And he and some other boys from South Wales lived with a landlady in Wilds Lane, who apparently used to beat them if they were late back. He was just 14. So he worked in the factory for 50 years and went from being treadle boy to a highly respected turner. And he married Margaret, who he met at the factory, and she was a handle caster. So here he's talking about one of his jobs when he first started in the cup shop.
When I came there first, and I was there for a while, and Mr. Dunn, he brought a cage in, and he put the cage in for the weekend. On a Monday morning we went in, and there's about 4 or 5 rats in the cage. So he said, "Hey Harry, take this down the canal and drop them in, will you?" That was my job. Oh yes, but I honestly, I can see it now, you know, when the Uta went, when it was time to finish at night at 5 o'clock, the rats would come out as soon as you heard that Uta go, in the cup shop. You could see them coming out, they knew everybody's gone, like, you know, or going. Yeah.
I'm sure there's a phrase, something like when the workers are away, the rats do play, and it literally was the case there. When they heard the hooter, the rats came out. Quite a few people told me about creatures in the factory. The junior painters, I was told, used to watch the mice in their department getting up to antics when they got bored of painting the same thing over and over again. And I even recorded a story of a lady painter bringing a rabbit to work until she got caught with it under her chair by the indomitable Mrs. Daisy Ray. And here she is. This is Daisy Ray on the left. She's leaning over one of her girls. Daisy Ray was the forewoman of the lady painters. And when people talk about her, there's both awe and a little bit of fear in their voices, but also no doubt that she cared deeply about her workers, her girls, as she called them, and had great pride in what they produced. And the group you can see on the right there, they're all paintresses who worked at Royal Worcester between 1946 and 1986. And this was one of my favourite interviews that I did for the Workers' Story, but it's also one of the hardest to conduct, as they all talked over each other as the memories literally flowed. So most of these ladies came straight from school to start work at the factory, some literally finishing school on the Friday and starting work in the factory on the following Monday. Indeed, Cynthia told me that she wore her school skirt and school blouse because that's all she had. They all talked about first impressions, the pervading smell of aniseed in the department, which was used in the paint, and Joyce's mum hating it so much that she wouldn't let her back in the house until she'd changed her clothes. And Cynthia recalls about 8 of them going to the cinema and hearing everyone around them saying, "Who's got aniseed balls? Who's got aniseed balls?" Because they all smelt so strongly of aniseed. So here they are at work in a couple of old photos from the archive, and here's a short extract from that group interview with Marion telling me about the first model she was ever allowed to paint.
It was called Only Me, and it had lots of little stitching round the dress and crosses.
You were following a colour standard?
Oh yes, you had patterns in the case. It was in a glass case, and whatever figure you had to paint, you had to go and get that pattern, and everybody used that, and it just went round everybody to make sure you all got the same colours.
And when you were doing this figure, did you do it all in one go, or did it have to be fired?
No, the flesh had to be done first, and that was the tricky part I found, to get the flesh smooth and all the same sort of, you know, it couldn't be any lumps in it or shading. That was what I found the worst. All the tiny bits and the eyes and the lashes I found easy, but the shading was very hard for me.
Absolute basics here, but you've got your figure which you're halfway through doing, and it's going for its first firing. Where did you put it, and how did you know that you got your figure back?
You signed on the bottom, she gave you a number and an initial. Mine was 7 or 7p for Phillips. In green, you had to do it in your own colour as well, didn't you? We had to keep to green or red or brown, whichever she said.
So if you happen to have an Only Me and you turn it up and see if it's got a 7p or a 7 underneath, then it could be one of Marion's. I just love hearing how people did their jobs. A little bit about Only Me. She was created by one of Royal Worcester's most famous modellers, Frida Doughty. And Frida was one of a pair of sisters, you've probably heard of them, Frida and Dorothy Doughty. And between them, they created a huge number of models for the factory. Here they are in the picture. I love that picture on the left. I think Frida is the one slightly in the background and Dorothy in the foreground. Dorothy tended to model birds and Frida children. One of Frida's best-selling series were the Days of the Week. You know, the sort of Mondays, Childless Fair of Face, etc., which you can see in the picture here, and which were first produced in 1938. There were 14 figures in total, 7 boys and 7 girls, and they were very collectible. And in my group interview with the paintresses, Frida Griffiths told me that if they wanted a particular figure for their own collection, which they were painting at the time, they would wait till Miss Ray was out of the room, and then they'd bang it on the table so it's slightly cracked. And at the end of the week, all the cracked ones could be bought by the girls for £1. So they got the one they needed for their collection. Frida Doughty was known to model from real life, and we have a really rather lovely written memory in the collection from Pamela Keddy. In the 1980s, Pamela was managing a Royal Worcester sale room in Oxford, and one day a man came in and went over to the cabinet of Frida Doughty figurines, and I'm going to quote now from Pamela. She said, "He gazed at them for some time and turned to me and said, 'Good morning, I'm Saturday Boy.' After that intriguing introduction, I engaged him in conversation and was delighted to hear that as a small boy, he had modelled for Frida in the Sisters' Garden and was quite literally the original model. There was no mistaking that cheeky smile of Saturday Boy which appeared on his face. He also added that he had kept in touch with Tuesday Girl and recalled those early years with great pride." So I love that. I think it's a lovely story. One of the purposes of the worker's story was to capture people talking firsthand about processes, as we've just heard. And some of these processes had already disappeared. From the 1950s onwards, as I kept hearing in the interviews, technology and machinery were utterly transforming the way almost everything was done in the factory, from casting to firing to decorating, and even things like packing and how things were marketed and sold. It was a real privilege for me to interview people with such specialist skills in so many different fields. And a lot of what they told me only existed in their memories. It was never written down. And when you hear it, it's laced with emotion, humility, sometimes a bit of exaggeration, but nearly always pride. The emphasis is often on detail, how things were done, what tools were used, clever techniques, and shortcuts which were passed down through the generations. And I've got some more examples of this for you. So here are John and Ken, two of the gilders who started work in the factory in the early 1950s. These two, wait for it, clocked up 97 years in the factory between them. So here they're going to describe a couple of processes, luster gilding and raising gold. And I love the fact that when they talk about gold, I feel that they're almost reverential. You can hear it in their voices. And they admit here that there's probably no one else left who would know how to do this sort of hand gilding.
Luster gilding, you put it on and it looks all brown, and when it's fired, it comes out all lovely and shiny, whereas the other gilding has to be sort of burnished. Princess Margaret, she was the last person to have luster. I used to have to do her pieces. If she broke anything, it used to come in and I used to have to do them. Ramekins and Colcotts, little tiny pieces that she had. I used to have a dozen at a time, and there was nobody left who knew how to sort of do luster because you had to get it so even. If you got it on too thick, it'd sort of cloud over and you wouldn't get the shine to it.
You can't raise gold as such. Any gold you put on is flat. So to make a raised gold effect, you use what we call raised paste, which is an enamel paste, which you mix up and use basically the same strokes as you would with gold, but you're using a thickness, which when it's dried out and fired, you can cover with the gold and it looks like raised gold then. So you're playing with that colour all day long to keep it the consistency you want it, and that is the experience really. You can't teach somebody that. That's only comes to experience. You know by looking and feeling how you need to fiddle with it to get it to the right consistency to work properly.
I think that's a classic phrase there. It only comes from experience, by looking and feeling. They were master craftsmen. John and Ken's work went off to be fired and moved into the hands of equally skilled men, the workers who loaded and unloaded the kilns. And as most people at the factory were paid by piecework, i.e. the number of pieces they did, the quicker the men in the kilns were, the better it was for everyone. It's pretty hard to imagine now as you stroll through the former factory site with its lovely flats and lovely views, that inside these buildings were kilns going night and day, and it was exceedingly hot all the time. This is Tony Hayes, and he worked in the kilns from the mid-1960s.
When we used to do the lustre kilns, the gold and silver lustre kilns, they became very uncomfortable, and when they got to a certain temperature, we weren't allowed to be in the room because of the fumes actually burning off. So this is where we try to sort the kilns out so they were actually firing overnight. It was warm, especially when the kilns first came out in the morning. You could actually feel the heat. You weren't supposed to unload the kiln for at least an hour or two after it came out, but we were on a piecework system, and obviously the quicker we unloaded the kilns and quicker we loaded them, that was where we got our payment. So we did tend to take things off if they were a little bit warm.
Did you ever burn yourself?
No.
Did anyone ever burn themselves?
Let's say we used to do a lot of trials for people, and people would come over who didn't actually work in the department, and they would go and try and pick it off the kiln. Then they started to learn their lesson when they burnt their hands.
I don't think that Tony sounds entirely sympathetic there. Another example of an incredibly skilled worker who I absolutely loved interviewing was George Morris. George started as a caster in 1948. In fact, I even love the story of how he ended up at Royal Worcester, because he was demobbed from the army and came to Worcester to find a girl that he liked. And he needed a job, and people pointed him towards the porcelain, and he got a job and stayed. He later became a mould maker, and he finally rose to be manager of porcelain development. George Morris worked closely with many of the Worcester greats, such as the modellers Doris Lindner and Bernard Winskill. Doris was famous for her horse and animal models, and Bernard for his military models. So here's a picture on the left of Doris doing some modelling. She's actually modelling, I think, a Charolais bull here. George did a lot of work with Doris and remembered being introduced to her originally and being told that he needed to treat her like a queen.
Only once that we had a row. She did mill reef, and I said to John Lance, who was the manager at the time, I said, it's too thin. I said, if that fire's down, it'll look like a greyhound. And he said, no, she doesn't make mistakes like that. I said, well, I'm sorry, Ed, it's going to look awful thin. He said, carry on. So we carried on, blocked it up and fired it. And she looked at it and she, what have you done? She said, it's too thin. I said, yeah. She said, I didn't model it like that.
So lots of people I interviewed talked about Doris Lindner, who was so incredibly talented. Several suggested that she was easier to work with after lunch, and that lunch often involved a certain amount of gin. I hope you don't mind me playing another clip from George, this time talking about working with the sculptor Bernard Winskill, who, as you'll hear, only had one leg. And that detail is important in the story that you're about to hear. So Bernard Winskill joined the design team at Royal Worcester in 1968, and his first commission was a series of famous military commanders on horseback. And it was George who created the moulds for him.
When we did Napoleon, and he put a piece of spring steel through the horse. So of course when we were cutting up, I had to cut the metal spring away to get it out, and the horse shot up. And I said, yeah, we better get that back down again. He said, oh, it looks better like that. So we left it. And well, if you saw the picture of Napoleon now, you can see it's beautiful. And that went on. So the next time, Wellington was all right, no problems with Wellington. But Washington came, and he ran into a telegraph pole in his car, because he only had one leg. He had an artificial leg, actually. And all right, he didn't damage the car too much, so he carried on to Worcester. And then they asked me to unmold to take it out of this box. And I said, Bernard, I said, the head's gone down. And he looked at it and I said, can you put it back up? And he said, yeah, I'll put it back up. And he looked at it and he says, no, he said, I'll just stick it there, put a bit of plasticine in the back of it. He said, he looks better like that. Now, if you look at Washington, his head, and look right behind the head, you'll find there's a flat piece between the neck and the back of the head. Anyway, he was happy with it. Everybody else was.
So if there's anyone out there with a Washington, I know what you're going to be doing tonight. You're going to be looking for the flat bit at the back of the neck. I mean, it definitely makes you look at models differently when you hear some of these stories behind the making of them. And so I recorded interviews in every department of the factory, but don't worry, I'm not going to take you through all of them, or we will be here all night. However, the long-term plan is to make far more of the workers' story audio available to the public. And if you've got any good ideas, creative ideas of how we can do this, please do get in touch. And please be as creative as you like. We'd love to hear from you. We really want the next generation to grow up with an understanding of what went on in the factory. And we want visitors to the museum and people who now live in the flats or simply walk through these buildings every day to be able to hear what it was like back in the day when people worked here. Right, so I'm going to move on to a bit of social life in the factory. Before we get to Christmas, I was told lots of stories about hijinks in the factory, some of which are definitely not repeatable. A lot of the work was boring and repetitive, and people made their own entertainment, and the junior painters were famous for it. Hanging from the beams seems to have been a favourite pastime, or setting things on fire. At one point, the lady painters held seances in the top floor of the decorating block. But we're not going to hear from those tonight. We're going to hear a little bit more about the plays and pantos and dances in the canteen. I love the photo in the middle of this slide of a very glamorous Pat Wormley in the early 1950s, sashaying down some steps. Pat was a typist, and she worked in the typing pool for several years in the early 50s. She didn't recall much about her work, but she could remember lots about her involvement in factory social life.
It was a really good fun time. Tony Childs, he started the drama group for Worcester Porcelain, and he was a very go-ahead man. He should have really been in the theatre. He was a very theatrical man, you know, and he decided that he would start this drama group. I can remember he put on 2 plays. One was about Mangelwurzels, and the other one almost like a private live play.
Did you ever go to dances there?
Yes. Oh, we used to enjoy our dances there because we had a chance then all the departments to mix together, because usually we didn't. They were, you know, in their own little world. We were all in our own little world.
Pat went on to tell me another great story about the day she missed the Queen. Or Princess Elizabeth, as she was at the time. Princess Elizabeth visited the factory in 1951, but Pat, who told me she had a terrible sense of direction, managed to go down the wrong alleyway and missed her completely. But 2 others who were around that day were Frida, who we heard from earlier, and Brian Cox. They were both teenagers at the time. Frida, as you know, was a paintress. Brian was also a painter who later specialised in painting horses, including the Bernard Winskill ones that we've just seen. Anyway, this is how Frida and Brian remember that famous day in 1951 when Princess Elizabeth came to Royal Worcester and the party that followed.
We had to wear our best clothes, we had to be tidy, we had to keep our benches spotless. We must not look up when she came through the door. We must keep our heads down. We must be absolutely dedicated to our work and only to speak or look up if she spoke to us. And unfortunately, she never got anywhere near me because I was at the back of the room, but she did speak to 1 or 2 of the juniors. But I'll never forget, I did look up when she came through the room because she's on her way, and the message was passing round, and she came through these doors with the managing director, Joe Jimson, was about 6'4", and Mr. McBratney, who was the works manager, and he was even bigger round than the other one. And the Queen, she looked like a little child. She only came up to their elbows, and I could always remember she was wearing the most beautiful shade of blue. We felt really chuffed to think that she'd been in our department.
We were all stood on the stairs watching her, and after she'd gone, all these journalists came and asked us how they could get to the front lodge quick. So we told them a roundabout route. How long it took them to get out there, I don't know. But of course we had a big do after that. For the long service employees, they had a dinner at the Guildhall. And for everybody then, they had a big dance at the Malvern Winter Gardens. And all the drink was free. And there was There was one of the lads out of our room who'd climbed over the back of the bar and was handing the bottles of drink out. There was people falling in the fountains there, drunk, and it was absolutely chaotic in there.
And quite a lot of people remember that particular party. And we'll come back to some more parties in a minute. But first, let's stay on the royal theme for a little bit longer. In 1977, a handful of workers were picked to go to Buckingham Palace, and this was for the presentation of the Queen's Silver Jubilee dessert service. This was another really big day for Royal Worcester. And Peter Ewan's top left was one of the designers who went along that day, and Dorothy Nee, below him there, was one of the lithographers. Her job was transferring patterns onto the plates in the dinner service. So here are their memories of the grand presentation at the palace.
It was a present from the royal households to Her Majesty and Prince Philip, and she was very, very precise about exactly what she wanted. She wanted a nice clean border design and the centres of the dessert service to be decorated with her pets, her horses, and the views of the main palaces, and that was very precise.
It was the day of the Derby, and the Queen and Prince Philip had been to the Derby, and all of a sudden a little bell rang and it all went quiet. These two glass doors opened and out stepped the Queen and Philip. She was so ordinary, you know, she had white gloves on that weren't brand new. You could see they weren't brand new, which was nice. And Philip had still got the mark round his head where his topper had been, you know.
At one end of the big banqueting reception room was a dais on which was laid out this banqueting service. Now, I must say, in that enormous hall, on an enormous dais, this little tiny banqueting service looked pretty insignificant. Anyway, the Queen duly came in after a busy day, followed by Prince Philip, walked across and duly admired in a gracious way all the things that we'd done. And the Duke then wandered down the line. He came up to me, turned round and said, "Is that it?"
I love that image, the splendour of the room, the magnificence of the day, this beautiful dessert service that had taken so many people, so many months to create. And then that comment, "Is that it?" So this brings us on to Christmas and Christmas parties in the factory. These were definitely a highlight of the year for many and varied very much from department to department. Let's go right back to the very earliest memories that I recorded now. These two, Arthur and Joyce, started at the factory in the 1930s. Arthur was in the inspection warehouse, and by all accounts, he was a real stickler for perfection. Nothing got past him. Arthur served in the Staffordshire Regiment during the war. He fought in Burma, and he came back to the factory when he was demobbed and stayed at the factory until his retirement in 1983. And Joyce, who we've heard from before, she started in 1937. But during the war, she moved to the Welwyn. Now, the Welwyn was a factory within the main Worcester porcelain factory doing war work, in fact, producing porcelain tubes which were used in radar. So Arthur and Joyce are going to take us back more than 80 years to Christmases past.
Oh, Christmas was all right. We used to all put so much away per week. And then Christmas time, you used to buy the beer, drink and food and everything, decorate the shop up. And then all our shop could have a laid out meal, like sandwiches and that and everything else, like, and a drink and all that. We used to do all right, we did. We'd have Christmas Day and Boxing Day. That's all we had then.
We had to make our own amusement to a certain extent. I can remember my first Christmas on the Welwyn. Things were short, decorations and that, but all of us being young, we wanted to do something. So we took all the old, I think they were requisition slips that would have gone in the bin. Some were pink and some were green. So we gathered them together and we cut them, and then stuck them all together, and they sort of stretched out, and we decorated our room. And we used to get together, you know, a bottle or two and have a little party before we broke up.
So each department had its own party in those days, as we've heard, and it seems they vied to outdo each other. So here's a few photos from the archives of various Christmas parties. So if you recognise those places or those people, or if you are one of those people in those photos on the left there, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. I'm not sure where that top photo left is, so let us know. Everyone looks rather smart and I think very sober in these pictures, but I don't think it stayed that way. Remember the fearsome Daisy Ray from earlier, the forewoman in the Lady Painters? Well, according to Frida Griffiths, Daisy went into super protective mode with her girls on Christmas Eve.
Daisy was always worried at Christmas time because the many painters used to have parties and we used to have parties and we used to decorate the department, and she wouldn't let us out because she said, no, it isn't safe. But Miss Rhea, I need the toilet. Well, I'll give you exactly 5 minutes, and if you're not back, I shall be in that toilet after you. And she wouldn't let the girls, especially the young ones. She really was concerned about them. And I mean, the men painters, they perhaps grab you and kiss you in the corridor, but I mean, it was nothing worse than that. But she was always so concerned, was Daisy. Of course, we couldn't wait to get out. They'd be lurking round every corner.
When we had 400 to 600 people, it really was a good time. And certainly the older ladies in each department used to provide all the food, and each department they vied for the best party on site. So again, the casters had a party, the painters had a party, the paintresses had a party. In 1974, it became illegal to have alcohol on manufacturing sites. So it changed then. We're almost in the centre of town, but certainly the Albion, which is out the back, the Alma and the Potter's Wheel, you had 400 to 500 people leave at lunchtime and all go and have a drink. You had a bit of a hierarchy where the makers were considered less posh or important than the painters who had the hand skills, but at Christmas they all came together. It was an excellent time for having a good time.
So I'm just imagining that sight of 400 or 500 of the workers leaving on Christmas Eve into the local pubs. That last voice you heard there was Keith Chambers, who was at that time responsible for maintenance on the site. And one last Christmas anecdote from Keith, when he didn't have quite such a good time, was the year when all the workers left to go to the pub, presumably, on Christmas Eve, and left the windows in their department open, and it was particularly cold weather that winter. And over Christmas, the pipes in the factory froze and burst, and there was a huge mess when everyone returned to work the day after Boxing Day. I think that my time is nearly up, so I'm going to thank you for patiently listening to me, and of course listening to the Worcester workers. And if this has interested you, I hope you'll watch out for more ways that we're going to be sharing our audio with you. This, as I said at the beginning, really is the tip of the iceberg. And we're really hoping to get more of the collection into the public domain. A quick mention to one of the ways that we'll be doing that. The logo that you can see on the slide there and the map below it, this is part of a genius thing, I think. It's an online mapping system where you can click on maps that show Worcester as it was in the 19th, 20th and 21st century. And then you can use the slider, which you can see on the slide there, to move across so you can see what the factory site was like back, say, in the 1940s and what it's like today and how it's changed. And you can see some green dots on the map there. Those dots are all places where an image or an audio clip or perhaps a video clip have been uploaded. And you too can upload your memories. They can just be written memories, or they can be photos, or they can be audio onto the digital map, so that it's really widely shared with anyone who wants to look at what Worcester was like, and particularly what the Worcester porcelain factory was like. So that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening. And as Sophie said at the beginning, do get in touch if you've got some memories. We can't promise that we've got the capacity to record everybody who comes forward, but we are always happy to hear your stories.